Hi, and welcome to Chapter 3. In this chapter, we're continuing what we started in terms of the institutional-based view. Chapter 2 was about formal institutions. We talked about the laws. And Chapter 3 is about informal institutions. Namely, we'll look at cultures, ethics, and norms with a strong focus on cultures. Very important. Down the line, we'll have even more work in cultures. This tends to be, I think, students usually really enjoy this aspect of the lectures and this aspect of the book because we really do learn a lot and accept the significance of culture in communicating and in business. Let's get going. So for the learning outcomes, we'll look at where informal institutions came from. We'll look at culture, which is going to be really challenging to define, by the way. And so we'll look at various ways of defining culture and manifestations of it. The three ways we can understand cultural differences. We'll look at understanding why understanding cultural differences is so important for global business. We'll also look at ethics, why ethics is so important. We'll look at identifying ways to combat corruption. We've talked about corruption already. If you remember Transparency International, the Perception Corruption Index. And so we'll do a little bit more there. We'll look at the norms associated with strategic responses when firms deal with ethical challenges. And norms is just a fancy way of saying, what everybody else is doing. Explain how you can acquire cross-cultural literacy. And this is, again, why this is so important for you. And I'm so glad you're taking this class because obviously you see the significance, the importance of understanding international business and opening and broadening up your mind in terms of the world. All right, let's get going. So let's start with informal institutions. Definitional aspect here originates from socially transmitted information, and it's part of the heritage that is considered cultures, ethics, and norms, which is why this particular chapter is split in these three areas. And looking at that, one term comes out when you look at cultures, ethics, and norms, which is the ethnocentrism. I'm sure you've heard that term before, ethnocentric behavior. Just split, look at the etymology of the word itself, ethno and centric. So the ethnic aspect becomes the center, right? Your own cultural aspect is at the heart, is at the center of everything. So the mentality held by a group of people who perceive their own culture, ethics, and norms as natural, rational, and morally rights. The United States, has that. You have to be very careful with it, but it's not the only country. China, in other countries, but the highlight here from our author is U.S. and China. So with the U.S., the term that you might have heard before, maybe in political science, is American exceptionalism. There's a French philosopher, Alexis de Tocqueville, when he came to the U.S., he was one of the first ones to address the exceptionalism of the United States. And then fast forward down the line, it gained traction and I think was even more popularized by Ronald Reagan, who used the actual term American exceptionalism often. The U.S. is exceptionally well endowed to lead the world. If you think about a country that does that, if you heard that from another country, that they thought of themselves as exceptionally well endowed to lead the world, I wonder how you would feel, right? And so, when you think about that approach, ethnocentric behavior, it definitely ruffles a lot of feathers. China has something similar. In fact, what's fascinating is the name of China in Chinese, right, is Zhuangguo, which of course I completely butchered. And it's these two characters that you see here. And the first character, even just look at the character itself, right? And you see the rectangle with the line going through it. This character means the center, the heart, the middle. And on the right, this refers to a country, right? And the best way to kind of look at the definition of China is that China is the center of the world. China is the heart of It's the center. It's the country at the center of everything. And so, even just the name China in Chinese gives you a strong ethnocentric display. Again, these are the countries that we're using as examples in your book, but they're not the only ones, right? You want to watch that. I always tell my students, when you travel to another country, I always have them kind of like play this, little mental exercise where you're at LAX, you're at the Tom Bradley airport there in LAX, and you're an hour away from boarding and getting into your flight to another country. And I always have them kind of visualize shedding their culture. Like visually remove your own culture and just leave it on the seat next to you. And just leave without it. And if you're able to kind of visualize doing that and what it entails that you keep an open mind wherever you go. You keep an open mind. You expect just about everything to be very different, especially if you're going, and we'll look at how to classify culture to a culture that is going to be different than your culture. And if you get there with that approach, you're going to have a better time, and you're, by the way, going to be a better guest, right? But if you carry that cultural baggage with you when you get there, you're not going to be able to help yourself and make comparisons of what they do to what you do. And if you expect what you want the way you want it, you're going to make yourself miserable and everybody else there too. Anyway, so just a little exercise to consider. Okay, so that's for the basic aspect of looking at informal institution. Now let's look at culture. So for culture, the collective programming of the mind, by the way, this is a very important definition. When you look at this definition, distinguishes the members of one group or category of people from another. It is part of a lengthy definition that we get from Gert Hofstede, and we'll talk about him. He's a pioneer in culture, and we'll so first the definition we're using is his definition, but also we'll definitely get into his work in this chapter, and by the way, later on in the class as well, we will continue to dig in. So the strict one-to-one correspondence between cultures and nations does not exist. Subcultures exist in multi-ethnic countries. I like the in focus in your author's book on page 39. It's about marketing to Hispanics in the United States. In 2000, I was lecturing at Cal Poly Pomona. And the reason I remember this so well, and I'm telling you about this right now, is right around prior to 2000, I want to say, second half of 1999, Sony bought Telemundo. And it was surprising to a lot of people that a Japanese multinational was buying this network that catered to Hispanics in the United States. They thought they were just kind of confused, what's going on? And it was big news. When Sony bought Telemundo, what Sony did is it invested a lot of money in the network. It streamlined a lot of the things. It brought in more advertising dollars. It did its homework in terms of how to market to Hispanics. So what you had all of a sudden is you had a greater effort with this multinational Sony that's been around and really well versed in itself catering to different cultures around the world. And what ended up happening is if you were around, or your parents remember, prior to 2000 on Telemundo, you would have what I refer to as lazy advertising. Lazy advertising would be a car commercial that would air in the United States and literally was dubbed in Spanish. And they thought just by translating into Spanish, it would resonate. And of course, that didn't work. It's the worst. And that in focus here talks about that. how you have to go beyond just translating. And what Sony did is it sat on Telemundo for a couple of years. And I don't remember, you guys can look it up, but I believe it sold it for about 5-6 times what it paid for. Not long after. And what happened in 2000 that made it so special? How did Telemundo gain so much value in 2000? Well, it gained value because of the census. When the 2000 census came out, it's for some weird reason, it surprised a lot of people and a lot of companies. And the big surprise was that people had underestimated several things that had to do with the Hispanic population of the United States. And what they had underestimated was first the amount of people, but even more importantly, the purchasing power and the effect on the economy. And once corporations discovered that, if you will, I remember it so vividly because I would go in a grocery store when all this stuff was hitting the news, and you could see that the grocery stores were scrambling all of a sudden to bring even food items that used to be in their quote-unquote ethnic section to kind of bring them forward into the mainstream. Jarritos, for example, used to be way out in the back, and now it was mainstream with the other sodas. And same with magazines. All of a sudden, People en Español was right there at the checkout as an impulse purchase, not buried somewhere. And so this is an example of, again, really getting into your own culture within your culture as a nation, right? So if the US has its own culture, of course it's going to have subcultures because we have multi-ethnic groups in the United States that we'll talk about more. All right. It consists of regional, ethnic, and religious layers, so I just kind of touched on that a little bit. So let's kind of dig in a little bit deeper here on culture itself and the components of culture. So components of culture, first, language. By the way, important that you remember what the components of culture are. There's really going to be some key components. The first one, obviously, is language. And, if I ask you, what do you think is the most spoken native language in the world? Think about that for a second. Maybe pause this lecture and think of a language, right? That language is Chinese. I don't know if you got it right. And again, the question, if you look at the question carefully, it asked for native language, not acquired second language, but native language. 20% of the world speaks Chinese. I shouldn't say is, but speaks Chinese. And by the way, the classification in this case is Mandarin, right? Not Cantonese, but Mandarin Chinese. And which is why, by the way, I always tell my students, if I were in your shoes right now, business major in 2020, I would be learning Chinese. I think it's a value-added thing for you. I love Spanish. This is what I studied in college. I think if you want to take Spanish, I think it's fantastic. I think you would be further differentiated if you added Chinese to the equation. We teach Chinese at Chaffey College. I think I mentioned this before. We have a fantastic professor, and half the students in her class are business majors. So what about English? For those of you who answered English and you thought, like, I could have sworn it was English everywhere I go. I've traveled before. People speak English. Well, you're right. You're right because English is the lingua franca, which means in Latin, basically, a global business language. It's the de facto language. When someone from Russia meets someone from Japan, and neither speaks the other's language, they're going to both default to English. So yes, English dominates lingua franca in the world. I always joke that if you're in a foreign country and you're lost and you want some help, just look for the closest university and don't even go to the English department because they'll learn how to speak English. Go to the business department, because you'll get a bunch of business majors who speak English and will help you find awesome deals wherever you are because of the business aspect. What's the disadvantage of English dominance? You might be thinking, like, what do you mean disadvantage? I can go anywhere in the world, and in many, many places, I'll find someone who can communicate with me. Think about this for a second. Every hotel on the planet is going to have someone who speaks English because that's going to be a requirement of the job. So what could possibly be a disadvantage? Think of it as laziness. Think of it as, in this case, an expat who's going to rely on English is going to miss cultural subtlety, that their counterpart will speak English to them because they've learned English as a second language, but that manager is going to not really truly understand the culture because they haven't really bothered with the language, the culture, and language plays such a huge role in culture. There are countries that protect their language. We'll talk more about that later on. So what else is a component of culture? Of course, the big one is religion, right? I have down at the bottom here, created a little table for you with the content from your author, right? And so the dominant religion in the world is Christianity at 1.7 billion people, and then Islam at 1 billion, in third place Hinduism, and then Buddhism, right? And so Christianity, of course, entails all of the Christian religions, including Catholicism, etc. And so 85% of the world has a religion. That's a big number, right? However, it's really important to understand that religion transcends religion. Let me explain. I studied in Mexico in early 2000. I was in Cuernavaca, south of Mexico City, at an international university there. And my professor, he was an econ business professor. We had a big segment on culture, and I will never forget what he said. He addressed the fact that Mexico is a de facto Catholic nation, right? This here is from the CIA World Factbook. As of what I just found today, 82.7% of Mexican population is Catholic, right? And so what does that mean? Everybody is Catholic, right? Well, in this case, we refer to the three types of Catholics, right? And so I have a picture at the top right of the screen, right, of the Peregrinos Guadalupanos. I'm sorry if I butchered that. And so these are people, every year some people have been recorded as walking over 100 miles in Mexico as they go through this pilgrimage of the Virgen de Guadalupe in Mexico City. And so, if you want to rank the three types of Catholics, the first type, and this is going back to my professor Felipe, who had shared that with the class, he would say the first type is the Catholic who is very pious. This is the Catholic who will go to Mass every Sunday and is extremely observant. Maybe this is someone who has done the lengthy trek for the pilgrimage, and so that's that one. The second type of Catholic is perhaps not going to be as pious, but is going to still go to church on Sundays, but not maybe going to the extent of the first type. And the third type is the one that said, my professor said, you never want to discount the third type because it, again, transcends religion and goes to the heart of culture. The third type is the one that he joked went to church 3 times in his or her life. At birth, when they were baptized, when they were married, and then when they died. 3 times in their life they went to church. They didn't observe. They didn't go every Sunday. But God forbid you try to let them know that they're not Catholic, and they will, let you know, of course they are. And that's where, the notion is that, in terms of culture and in terms of adherence, you have to make sure that you understand that the fiber of religion even transcends religion as a strong component of culture. Let's see. So now let's move away from, in this case, the language and religion component And let's look at cultural differences within that context. So how do we classify cultural differences, right? So the first thing we're going to do, and this is going to be really important for you to remember because we're going to talk about this for the rest of the class. But the first thing you want to do is know that we're going to classify things in context. Very important, context. And if you think about context, you've heard context is everything. And before we even go into all kinds of definitions, let's just look at just context itself, right? Background against which interactions take place. Wow, okay. That could mean so many different things, right? Think about people you've interacted in your life who are from overseas, right? And think about communication, and think about things that maybe you found were a little bit different about how you communicated, right? Think about silence, for example. You ask someone a question. We in the West, as a Western culture, we, especially in California, in the United States, we value speed. We really value speed. It has to do with efficiency. It has to do with how we do things. We even associate speed with IQ. The IQ test is a timed test. And so when you ask someone a question and they pause and there's silence and they think and then they answer, if you just follow your own context, you might think there's something wrong here. But in their context, their culture is that I need to really think about your question because I value you enough to really put thought into what you're asking me and reflect on it and give you an answer. And things become very interesting in that sense, right? Would you make a deal with someone who's selling you a car and you guys decide you're going to shake hands on it, and they tell you all these things like there's going to be that kind of a warranty and there's going to be this and I'll throw in a turbo and they want to shake hand on it? Are you going to be satisfied with that? And so that is when we're going to look at culture and context. So let's start with low context culture. In low context culture, communication is usually taken at face value without much reliance on unspoken condition or assumption. And the United States is an extremely very low level, high level, low context culture. Sorry for the double negative here, but it's actually a high level, low context, I guess would be an oxymoron more than a double negative, but I digress. So low context culture, if the United States is a low context, which it is, a low context culture, what it means is that what you say to me, how you behave, is going to be less important than what is on the contract that we're signing together, right? We're not leaving anything up to chance. We're going to have a discussion and we're going to talk about this contract and we're going to sign it. That's what that is. So that's the low context culture here. A high context culture is exactly the opposite. Communication relies on the underlying unspoken condition or assumption. And this is where you will see a lot of Asian and even Middle Eastern cultures, but most pronounced are going to be the Asian culture, especially China, where in this case, I'm trying to close a deal. I represent an American company and I'm at a meeting here with my Chinese counterpart and everything is going great. And I want to close the deal. And I say, so are you ready? I mean, is this all of the sound that, all the things that I said to you, are you guys willing? Are you ready to sign the deal? And the answer is, we have to check for permits. We have to make sure that all of the government permits would agree with this kind of a thing. Or they might say to you, yes, I'm not actually the decision maker alone. I have to check with my team to make a decision. And so basically, in fact, there was in one of the textbooks that I used to use for global, there was an interesting little page that was titled "How to Say No in Japan Without Saying No," and this was a Japanese example where you don't say directly no to your counterpart because that is not culturally done. It's disrespectful. But what I want to do is I want to say no without saying no. So think about if you were doing business and you didn't do your homework and you don't really truly understand the high context culture, and the person said to you, we have to check for permits, you're going to get back to your hotel and you're going to order champagne and celebrate because you're thinking, we're done. Hey boss, they just only need to check for permits. And you're not realizing they just said no to you. So let's look at the spectrum. When we look at the spectrum of culture, high context, low context. So here we go on the left, very, very high context. Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Arab, and all the way to the right, in fact, even lower than American and British and Canadian. You have the Scandinavian countries and the Germans and the Swiss countries right there, where if everything is going to be explicitly outlined, we will not leave anything up to chance. So of course, if you have a German engineer going to China to do business, that German engineer better understand how to do business in that cultural aspect the Chinese way. All right, so that's the first approach, right? I want you to remember that in this approach, we're looking at context, approach number one. Now let's look at approach number two. For approach number two, we're looking at cluster. And here, we're going to group countries that share similar cultures as one cluster. So what do we have here? The underlying idea is that people and firms are more comfortable doing business with other countries within the same cluster or civilizations. Later on in this class, we're eventually going to get into trade blocks, right? And when we get to trade blocks, let me find that for you very quickly. When we get into trade blocks, we will look at, there we go, it's going to be chapter 8, right? Chapter 8, capitalizing on global and regional integration, chapter 8. And those we refer to those as trade blocks, right? So if you think about the North American Free Trade Agreement, up until recently it existed, NAFTA, and now it's the US MCA, right? USMCA, US, Mexico, and Canada. It's been rebranded. And so if you look at those trade blocks, and if you look at even the history of trade around the world, and you start with the United States, up until recently, our number one trade partner on the planet is Canada. And what I mean by trade partner, I don't mean buying. Buying is great, but just you're shipping your money somewhere else when you're buying, right? I mean, like, who's your best customer? And I think we talked about this before. Who's your best friend? And Canada historically has been the United States' best friend. This is the country that has bought more from the US historically than any other country. Does that make sense? Well, of course. Number one, we're neighbors. Number two, we speak the same language, right? I mean, Quebec is a province, they speak French, but otherwise, Canadians speak English. Look at the currency they're using. It even has the same name, Canadian dollar, US dollar, and often almost on a one-to-one par. Not always, it fluctuates, very, very close, right? And how about doing business, right? Look at the cluster approach we just did. Canada and the US are on the same end of the spectrum for the cluster approach on low. We're not even both low. We're on the same level of low. So it makes a lot of sense that the US and Canada would be best friends when it comes to trade. And so what you have with the cluster approach is basically, again, you're naturally more comfortable doing business with countries that share a lot with you, namely even language, right? And then culture. Now, let's look at those cultures, the clusters. Let's look at the clusters. So you have 3 different groupings of clusters. Ronin Shankar, you have the globe, and you have Huntington civilizations. And as you look at this, you will see that they're called differently. Let's go with, Anglo. Ronin Shankar at the top, Anglo, globe at the top, Anglo, and Huntington, let's just call it Western. Now, let's go back to column 1. Ronin Shankar are differentiating Anglo and Germanic, right? Globe does the same thing, Anglo, Germanic Europe. And then Huntington just goes Western 1, Western 2. And then what about the rest of Europe? So then we're going into Latin Europe for both Ronin and Globe. And for Huntington, let's just call it Western number 3. And then what about the Nordic countries? No problem. Ronin Shankar, Nordic. Globe, Nordic Europe. And then Huntington, Western 4. So, it's just fascinating. Even when you look at, let's call it Russia and the Eastern Bloc states, you have Eastern Europe for Ronin Shankar, Eastern Europe for Globe, and let's just call it Slavic Orthodox for Huntington. Again, it's fascinating because it makes so much sense, right? You're going to be wrong about a lot of the stuff, right? You're going to be wrong because, of course, it's just ridiculous to try to group everybody in the same boat, right? So let's look at, so that's for the cluster approach, right? Next, what we're going to do is we're going to break away from cluster, and now we're getting into the really, really interesting one, the dimension approach, right? And so before we get into the dimension approach, remember the 3 approaches, right? So very important that you guys remember that we're doing this cultural thing by looking at these 3 approaches, right? Context is the first one, right? And after that, when we're going into context, now we're going into cluster, and then finally dimension right here. So dimension is going to probably be the one that is going to be, I would say, the one that you're going to hear about the most. The gentleman who came up with this is Gert Hofstede. So let's go there. So he comes up with all of these different classifications, right? Power distance, individualism versus collectivism, masculinity, femininity, uncertainty avoidance, and long-term orientation. And I really want you to know that this is the most influential approach of the 3, right? Why? Because the context, first of all, gives you only one dimension, right? And it's really not giving you a lot in regards to differences of countries within its own cluster, right? So you're looking at all these countries within a cluster, and think about what what we did before when we were talking about subcultures, etc. And so what do we have here? First of all, the power distance at the very top is the extent to which less powerful members within a culture expect and accept that power is distributed unequally. And so if you're okay with your boss being, special, having more money, and you can't just waltz in and hang out and talk to them, and they're on a whole different level, that would be a high power distance. Russia is, like, I believe, the highest level of anybody else. Last I checked, your book actually on page 43 has a graph at the very top here. And I'm going to give you an update on that in just a second, but Russia is listed at having a power distance of 95. On the other hand, Sweden is at 31. Sweden is more egalitarian. And so, no, in this case, power distance is ranking a lot lower because you're not that special, and we're going to interact with you the way we're going to interact. Then we're getting into individualism versus collectivism, and so this has to do with an individual's identity is fundamentally theirs and tied to the intensity of their collective group. Well, no surprise here when you look at individualism. Let's see if you can guess which country in the world ranks highest in individualism. If you guess the US, then you're right. We are the most individualistic country on the planet, right? And then collectivist countries, Pakistan is showing as a 14. But, you look at China, a lot of Asian countries are going to rank very, very low in individualism, very collectivist when it comes to that. Masculinity versus femininity, it's basically a role differentiation between sex within a culture. And so, again, are men acceptedly treated differently or treating everybody differently than women, etc., right? I probably shouldn't, but I use the word macho, right? Is this a very, very macho culture, or is it a very egalitarian culture? The highest level of masculinity in the world, let's see if you can guess a country where the most macho country in the world, if you will, is Japan. Japan ranks at 95, right? And so very, very, very high there. It's a problem. In fact, if you're following the news, Prime Minister Abe is stepping down as Prime Minister of Japan, and during his tenure, he's really turned the economy of Japan around. But he also was at the helm of some criticism when it came to the cabinet. There were female cabinet members that stepped down over discrimination or how things were not really egalitarian when it came to men and women being treated in Japan, and especially in higher office. So uncertainty avoidance is the next one. It's the extent to which members in a culture accept or avoid ambiguous situations and uncertainty. And that's a big one. Because if you're going to do business, things will be uncertain, right? So low uncertainty versus high uncertainty avoidance, right? Japan, very, very, very high on uncertainty avoidance, whereas Sweden, Singapore is rock bottom at 8. It's the lowest, right? So in this case, Singapore is going to be okay with not having all the details, with being flexible to change and adapting, whereas a country like Japan, change is bad. Change is very, very bad. Let's see. And then long-term orientation here, perspective that looks at, emphasizes perseverance and savings for future betterment. So no surprise here. We rank one of the lowest. I think Pakistan basically is 0. Russia is at 10, but the US is ridiculously low. China is at 118. Japan is at 80. We tend to live in the moment. It's interesting, right? Think about savings account. How many people even really have one that they're really developing? And it's, especially if you're a college student, now's the time. Now's the time for you to have 20% of your income go into some kind of investment or savings account and pretend it doesn't even exist. Just let it be. We don't really, we need improvement there. So let me focus on one of those dimensions here, and let me focus on masculinity. So this is Gert Hofstede, right? He is the person who created the whole spectrum approach here. And there's a clip here that he has on masculinity versus femininity. I will let you watch this clip on your own. It is 10 minutes long, but I really, really hope you watch it. I encourage you to watch it. He's a really interesting guy. And again, he's the one who came up with all that stuff, right? So if you look at masculinity as a strong form, men tend to have occupations that reward assertiveness. So in Japan, in this case, that's what this means, that being leaders, managers, bosses, etc. And women tend to work in more caring, quote unquote, profession. Femininity, in relative weak form, women occupy positions that reward assertiveness. So in this case, if the cultural approach is weak on femininity, is what this means, then you're talking about the Nordic countries, for example. Sweden, Norway, Finland rank extremely high extremely low on masculinity. And so in this case, what that means is that women do hold an equal amount of higher offices, etc., and glass ceiling is not predominant. And then also, reversely, more men work in caring professions. Now what I want to do is bring you up to the next. So there's Hofstede again. This is another one that I really hope you watch. This is about culture in business education. I have it there. It'll be posted on the site, but I hope you watch it. He's got a lot of really cool videos where he shares his work, and they're free. And so that's now kind of the reason I didn't paste the Exhibit 3.3 in your book on page 43 is because instead of pasting that, I wanted to just have you, kind of hear it from the horse's mouth. And so in this particular case, this is, Gert Hofstede's own website where you can actually go and compare countries, right? So let's scroll down here. And obviously the benchmark is going to be the US, so we can have a comparison that makes sense for us. So what I love about his website is you could just plug in whatever you want. And so now that we have the US, I know we talked about Japan, so let's put Japan over here. And let's also put Sweden, since we did talk about Sweden. And there we go. So power distance, again, Japan, very, very high. Sweden the lowest, the US about 40. But if you look at the record-breaking ranking, Japan for masculinity is at 95, Sweden is at 5. In comparison, the US at 62. So there's still a lot of room for us to get cracking over here. Look at our uncertainty avoidance with Japan. We had talked about that. But also look at long-term orientation with Japan, right? Anyway, so you can put in whatever you want. I think it'd be a great idea for you if you're going to travel somewhere this summer. Well, not this summer. Whenever it's safe for us to travel, and you decide you want. I've always wanted to go to New Zealand. And there we go. Wow, look at this. Culturally, I don't think I need to really worry too much about in terms of the comparisons for culture. I think I might be okay, right? On the other hand, if I want to go back to Slovenia, let's see what's going to be different for me. Oh, wow, look at that. So Slovenia in individualism, way, way lower, much more collectivist, right? Slovenia, again, masculinity, much, much lower than the United States. That's fantastic. Way higher on uncertainty avoidance, right? So, and power distance again. So I'll leave it at that for that. Let's move along. I hope that you found this interesting. Now, understanding cultural differences to do global business. So global business activity is consistent with the context, cluster, and dimension approaches, which is why all three were covered. The average length of contract is longer in low context than it is in high context countries. That should make a lot of sense. Many agreements are unspoken in high context countries. Remember, I even talked about agreeing to something just by virtue of a handshake. That still happens. So how do you prepare for that? Firms are cautious when dealing with countries from other clusters. And maybe cautious is, not a good word. Maybe it should be, prepared. Do your research. But maybe, obviously Cautious meaning don't default back to your own culture when in doubt. When in doubt, make sure you research first. Let's see. So individualistic societies foster high level of entrepreneurship. That should make a lot of sense, right? Individualistic firms aim to differentiate themselves. So there is definitely a high element of reward for people to decide on their own that they want to try to do something. I remember articles, in different publications over the years, with stories like, what if Bill Gates had been, Russian or something, and looking at different cultures perhaps that are less individualistic, and what the differences would have been for someone like him. Collectivist firms, they follow each other. Managers in high masculinity society they're assertive, they're decisive, they're aggressive. By the way, if you come from a high masculinity society and you're doing business in a low masculinity society and you don't change your ways, something's going to pop up, and it's called sexual harassment or discrimination. Managers in high femininity society are less visible, more intuitive, and seek consensus. How about managers in low uncertainty avoidance countries rely more on experience and training? And for high, they just follow the rules. Again, really, I hope you're appreciating the effort and the preparation that it's going to take for these companies to enhance their global footprint, or start even with one country to do business with, by ensuring they've really, really done their homework. Let's see, ethics, principles, standards, and norms. So we're switching over now to ethics, right? That govern individual and firm behavior. Basic definition here. It's reflecting informal laws and regulations. There is a code of conduct, which is a set of guidelines for making ethical decisions, and that code of conduct in ethics is going to differ maybe from country to country. Maybe might not by a lot by some countries, but it might. So in terms of the views on ethical motivation of firms, there are three. What I did here is I just included the definitions that we had from your author, right? So there's the negative view, the positive view, the instrumental view. Easy enough. Negative view, that firms may jump onto the bandwagon of ethics under social pressure, but just for show. We call that window dressing, right? Maybe they're not really trying to improve. It's just like, hey, look at us, we're great. The positive view, same, though not all firms may be self-motivated to do it right, regardless of social pressure. Some, not all. And so they're doing it because they think it's the right thing to do. And the instrumental view, good ethics may be good, useful instrument to help make money. A lot of people go, well, the end justifies the mean. As long as they're doing it, I guess, fine. Let's go with now the school of thoughts on managing ethics overseas. The first one is ethical relativism. I mean, just look at the two words together, right? Ethics, ethical, relativism. And so this is where all ethical standards are relative. The best way to understand that is, the old quote, when in Rome, I'm sure you know the quote, do as the Romans do. By the way, I really encourage you to watch the videos of Gert Hofstede, because he actually gives you the whole story of just that quote, and how that's like the oldest record we have on culture. I think it was 4 AD, and some pope, a bishop is the one who coined it. But it's a really interesting story. So I hope you do watch the clip. They're each 10 minutes on culture. So that's for ethical relativism. Remember that it can backfire, right? If you come from the United States and you understand that we have different laws, and look at just sexual discrimination, right, or sexual harassment, and you go into a country where the practices are a little bit more outdated, and you follow their practices, is that ethical? Because you should know better. Ethical imperialism, in this case, the absolute belief there's only one set of ethics and one possesses it, and it's you. Congratulations, your way's the best, right? And so maybe you can think back of a previous definition that we've talked about here as to how you want to watch out for that one, because it's going to backfire. So, you can't really go one way. Ethical relativism can backfire. Ethical imperialism is definitely going to backfire eventually. So what do, right? Well, in this particular case, the best way is, came up, values, intentions, ethics away from home. These three approaches were, put together by Dr. Thomas Donaldson. I have him here, just give you a little bit of background about him. He's a professor at Penn and at Wharton School. And he just kept it simple. Respect for human dignity and basic rights, respect for local traditions, and respect for institutional context. And so that really might be the better approach, because that's the approach that's going to be the good middle of the road for you to do it the right way. Now that we've done ethics, let's go to corruption, right? So corruption, I know we talked about corruption before in the previous chapter. I talked to you about Transparency International and Foreign Corrupt Perception Index, right? So corruption, abuse of public power for private benefits, usually in the form of bribery. By the way, you guys, I hope you watch the news. We're not immune to that. How many politicians have gone to jail over accepting, literally suitcases of money? So it's everywhere. I remember when I studied in Mexico, there's a joke which was the national pastime in Mexico is tax evasion, and the quote was, how is it so possible to not pay your taxes in Mexico? And in some parts, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but in some parts it's unfortunate, but it's the person who's going to come knocking at your door to collect taxes that they're going to take a mordida, and there you go, you don't have to pay taxes anymore because someone took a little bribe. So I remember when I was studying Mexico, and I asked my professor, it's interesting because yes, there's an acceptance of corruption in Mexico. When you get pulled over and you pay the federale, whatever you want to pay to get away, that's corruption, and it exists. And so, but it also exists in the U.S. on a different level. And I asked him, how do you differentiate? And I'll never forget what he said. He said, well, in the U.S. you're just better at corruption because you're better at hiding it. And that was almost like an instant answer that he had for corruption. It's just more open in Mexico. They're not trying to hide it as much. Let's see. Corruption is again abuse of public power for private or benefit, casually the form of bribery. It causes misallocation of resources. Case in point, taxes. If you look, we'll talk about the European Union in this class, especially throughout the class. But when you look at that block, right, the European Union block, and you look at the economies of the European Union, right now I'm following through the Economist magazine intelligence unit, and they're having a lot of data about the health of some of the European countries as they're going through here, and they're predicting the outcome of some of these countries in the next year, 2 years, 3 years. And Spain and Italy, they're predicting 3 to 4 years, whereas Germany and France maybe 1 year. And one of the problems for Spain and Italy that is not as pervasive in Germany and France is taxes. And when you look at the percentage of tax revenue based on the population, you will see a higher percentage of tax collection and revenue from citizens in Germany and France, which basically is going to help you pay your budget. But in Spain and Italy, you have a much, much lower level of tax collection, which makes it a lot harder to pay for your government when you do. So again, corruption really causes great misallocation of resources. I'll post, by the way, the videos on Canvas from the Economist Intelligence Unit that discuss this. It slows economic development. So I just talked about that. And then very important, foreign direct investment. Remember when we talked about Transparency International and corruption perception index? The higher the perception index of corruption, the less investment you're going to get from overseas. That's it. Multinationals are the ones investing. Corporations are investing. They're the ones who are thinking, I think I should build a factory in this country and try my luck and hopefully it'll work. But if there's a lot of corruption and a lot of uncertainty, they might decide, I don't know, because it might be too expensive for me because, yes, they'll say, oh yeah, sure, build your factory, but 2-3 years later, all of a sudden, everybody wants me to pay more. And so it discourages FDI, which of course is less revenue for you. The more FDI you have, the more investment you have, and that gets spread around. If there's a factory open up in your state, just think about all the jobs that come with that factory, not just people in the factory. The distribution, the logistics that's tied to it, the suppliers, they're tied to it, the services, the accountants, the lawyers, all of these people, right? So FDI is really critical to the development of the economy of a country. All right, now, how do you fight corruption? All right, so we have something in the US. It was kind of late in the game that we kind of came up with it, 1977, but it bans briberies of foreign officials. And a lot of corporations complain, like, that's not fair. That's not fair. We can't compete. If we're doing business in the Middle East, for example, where, a gift, they don't call it a bribe, it's a gift. And sometimes it's a nice Rolex, and sometimes it's a car. It's a gift. And you're telling me that I can't do that. You're making it very, very hard for me to compete with a European company, perhaps, that doesn't have the same constraints. And so it's not fair. Well, the good news is a lot of there's a UN Convention Against Corruption. In fact, let's talk about that. And more and more companies, especially Western companies, have signed off on that and said, fine. Here's the problem. The problem is that there are offshoots of companies that have been created, perhaps. If you're a big multinational and you know that as long as you're going to be listed on New York Stock Exchange operating as an American company, you're going to be subjected to this. But maybe there's some independent subsidiary that you'll open up somewhere where it's located close to where you're doing business, and maybe that'll help. And so we're not there yet for sure, not even close. So let's talk about norms. Norms. I was thinking, you're on the freeway and you get pulled over. And you're like, officer, what do you mean I was going 75 miles an hour in a 65 miles an hour? I was going with the flow of traffic. Everybody's doing it, right? So norms, prevailing practices of relevant players that affect the focal individuals and firms. So it influences the way in which firms respond to ethical challenges, right? So let's just go there and then look at those strategic responses to ethical challenges. So there's 4 ways to go: the reactive, the defensive, accommodative, and proactive. I decided to kind of add a little bit to this, and I'll explain in just a sec. So the reactive is I didn't do it, and I do less than, so here the example was General Motors in the 2000. The defensive, yes, I was wrong, but I'm going to fight it, and I'm going to do the least amount required. So Nike sweatshop in the 90s. Accommodating, accept responsibility, do all that is required. Toyota in 2010, sticky pedal, car takes off. Ford in 2000. What I did here is I updated that a little bit. I when I read this, I thought, let me just kind of actually speak up on that a little bit more, because when I read the case in the book, I wanted to, share something with you that is not stated in the book. The problem with Ford and the tires blowing up, right? You've heard about this, right? So, Ford Motor Company, they sold a Ford Explorer. Tires were Firestone tires. They were defective. The tires would blow out and the cars would roll over and people would die. And so here's the problem. The problem is this happened in the United States. and claimed over 100 lives, right? But the problem is that Bridgestone Firestone knew in '97 that there were concerns about their tires, but took no corrective action. In '97, a Ford dealership in Saudi Arabia alerted Firestone to problems with its tires and urged the tire maker to recall tires in '95, '96, and '97 Ford Explorers. We're talking about a recall. A recall in another country, '95, '96, '97. Ford knew, right? Here's more. All I have to state, I believe the situation is to be a safety concern. This is a letter that the person at the dealership wrote to Firestone. I'm asking what's going on. Do we have a fatality before? Do we have to have a fatality? I mean, look at the words. Look at the question. A fatality in '98. Ford ultimately replaced the tire in the Middle East, but neither company informed the U.S. government of the problems. Now, the law changed because of Ford. The law changed because of Ford and Firestone. They were selling the same tires in the United States, but failed to say anything. And so I will update your author on this, by the way. It takes a lot of people to write a book, and a lot of people participate. I'm not sure, maybe there's a reason why it's still there, but when I see that it's listed as an accommodative strategic behavior where you accept responsibility and do all that is required, I'm not so sure because of what I just shared with you. Proactive, you anticipate responsibility and do more than is required. BMW in the 90s, so the author shares with us about how BMW was brilliant in terms of even not only just having a policy of having the parts of their cars more built in a way that they were more suitable for recycling, but even buying recycling centers throughout Germany, etc. Another example would be Mercedes-Benz. Mercedes-Benz invented the airbag. Who told them to do that? What policy said you have to spend millions of Deutschmarks back then in research and development so that you can come up with a balloon that will deploy on a steering wheel and help people survive a deadly crash? No one told them. So in this case, very, very proactive of them. I mean, when you consider, of course, airbags are the law, not just in the US, but in most countries. So what are the implications for savvy managers? All right. Well, enhance their cultural intelligence. That's the first one, right? And what is that cultural intelligence? Someone's ability to understand and adjust to new cultures. The author talks about this, but this is where people, I usually ask this in class, and I hope I don't get in trouble for doing this, but I always like to ask my students, how many students have a season pass to Disneyland, right? And they raise their hands. And I ask how much it costs, and they tell me. And then I share with them, the cost of a flight to another country of their choice, and how much it would cost for 1 week in that country. And sometimes they're blown away. Sometimes it's 2 trips to countries overseas that they could afford with those season passes. And again, I'm not trying to. I don't hate Disney. I think Disney is a fantastic company. But what I'm saying to you is this: you're American, and you have a gift, and your gift is you have a very, very powerful passport. That passport allows you to travel to so many countries even without a visa. That's power. We'll talk about the power of a passport later on in the class. And I hope you take advantage of it, and I hope you expand your horizons and expand your cultural intelligence. And by the way, going to a country doesn't make you more culturally intelligent at all. Being prepared, researching the culture before you go, trying to appreciate the culture before you go, understanding how people behave, how do you greet people, learn sentences, learn greetings, take it in. Don't just go there and just try to see everything from a tour bus. That's horrible. Be aware of the prevailing norms and their transitions globally in terms of what is happening right now. What are the phases in acquiring cultural intelligence? So again, this is probably the phase we're exposed to now with this lecture, or before. Recognition of pros and cons of one's cultural mental software. Appreciation of people from other cultures. You're so lucky. You're so lucky because we're in Southern California. And when you're in a class with people from other countries who grew up in other cultures. Maybe you're one of them. Why don't you just share? Why don't you get to meet each other and get to discover, ask questions? The knowledge, the cross-cultural literacy, ability to identify symbols, rituals, and taboos in other cultures. The skills, good practices based on awareness and knowledge of other cultures. The author, the way he concludes the chapter is great. What the author does is really make a case and encourages you to please, go see the world. On page 49 at the bottom, I'm going to read what he says. This means that you, a student studying this book, are advised to invest in your own career by picking up at least one foreign language, spending one semester or year abroad, and reach out to make some international friends who are taking classes with you, perhaps sitting next to you. Such an investment will make you stand out among the crowd and propel you in your future culture. Not only that, it'll make you a better person. And so, what are the implications for actions? Be prepared. Slow down. Again, slow down is a big one for us because, again, we live in a culture where speed is rewarded, right? Establish trust. You'll learn when we do business overseas, depending where you go, but in many, many cultures, talk about taboo. The biggest taboo is to just talk business right away, which is a very, again, when you talk about low context, it's a very low context thing to do. In many low context culture, I'm flying over here in your place. I'm getting to my hotel the next day. We're gonna meet, at your conference room. I'm gonna introduce myself. Maybe we do a little tiny bit of chit chat. Maybe not even that, and we just get right to business. And then after a couple of years, I get back in the plane, go back home. No. In the Middle East, in Latin America, we're gonna get to know each other for a while. In fact, forget the hotel. When you pick me up at the airport and I'm thinking that you're being very courteous and wow, I didn't know you, my counterpart, was going to actually greet me at the airport, you're going to take me to your house. I'm going to stay in there's a guest room. Your wife is going to cook for me while I'm there. We're going to get to know each other. How amazing is that? And can you imagine if you said like, oh, no, I really do, please take me to the Hilton. Well, you could kiss that contract goodbye. Establish trust. Understand the importance of language. Language is sacred, people. You know this, right? Language is sacred. It's in some cultures, if you approach someone on the street and you don't make an effort by asking them in their own language if they speak English, even if they speak fluently, and you approach them and you say, do you speak English in English? They'll say no. They want nothing to do with you. You disrespect their culture. You're in their country. You're not even making an effort. Respect cultural differences. That's another one. Someone is showing up late to a meeting and you're in their turf. You know what? That I have friends, my buddy from Senegal calls it African time. It's African time, maybe an hour late. But I have friends in Latin America that say the same thing. It's Mexican time. So it's a cultural thing. Expect delays. Don't start to reprimand someone because they're 30 minutes late to a meeting. Everybody knows that if you're calling a meeting at 9, I'll be there at 9:30, 9:45, and by the way, 9:30 is early. Understand that no culture is inherently superior in all aspects, which is a really important one for us Americans, because we, it's a very easy trap to fall into. Like, what do you mean I'm not the best? Look at my GDP. I'm number one, baby. I know everything. So, all right, key terms. Again, make sure that you wrap your head around all these key terms so that you need to know them, not just for the exam, for the quiz, but you need to know them because they're really going to be a building block for the rest of the class, right? we've covered all of them. And in terms of the summary, same thing. Make sure that you wrap your head around all of the things we've looked at in terms of the summary of the chapter, and that will help you with the quiz. All right, you guys, I will see you next time for chapter 4.